Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Nick Rohn, Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I am very excited for today's program, the start of the 2024 ALN Federal Asset Leadership Insights, a series of programs today, tomorrow, and next Thursday. And today's program, we'll talk with ALN CEO Jim Dieter, Dominic Townsend, President, ABS Quality Evaluations, and Byron Dunlap, Enterprise Asset Manager for the Architect of the Capitol. As well, we will then have a GAO panel facilitated by Amelia Shachoy. And before we get to our actual program, we just want to thank our patron members, Jacobs, Mantech, Onuma, ABS Quality Evaluations, and CGI, as well as all our organizational members for making programs like this possible. And please reach out if you're interested in working with the ALN. We would love to partner with every organization in the world. We do not believe in gatekeeping, and we would like to bring the important insights that the federal government is now showing to every organization of all sizes. And with that, we do have a program tomorrow featuring a federal panel from the Army Corps of Engineers, Bonneville Power, and the EPA. And we will then next Thursday have a program featuring Roger Grant, a preview of their National Institute of Building Sciences Digital Twins 2024 conference. So a lot of upcoming events. And we're really excited for this program today. And we would just like to say, if you're out there and sharing our excitement or have any questions, thoughts you want to share, please send those to the chat, or you can use the Q&A function, and you can, I think, even make your question anonymous that way. So we really hope to have some good questions for our panelists and speakers today. Mike Bordenero, ALN Executive Director, welcome.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick, for starting things off and for the long tenure you've had in supporting these federal activities. And I am honored to be introducing Jim Dieter. So Jim Dieter set up the Asset Leadership Network. Jim was a federal contractor for the bulk of his career and very interested in standards and ASTM, the National Property Management Association, and saw that the US needed an organization that really promoted the concepts that are advocated in the ISO asset management system, and then actually took it to just asset management in general. There are many governance approaches that just do asset management. And because Jim was involved in the federal government, and actually some of the other members of the US Technical Advisory Group were federal executives, the Asset Leadership Network got a good foothold in the federal government. And there were advocates who were already looking at asset management. Bob Leach at the Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works had been strong on it. And actually his group gave the first federal asset management presentation on what they were doing. That was in 2015. And we've got a long history of presentations from federal executives. So we're really happy that many of our organizational members are heavily involved in federal asset management. Some of the people attending here, James Downs with Mantech and Ed Safdie at Guidehouse, but also CGI and Onuma, and many of the Jacobs heavily involved in federal asset management. So it's been a pleasure for us to be a forum to share the learnings, the best practices that have been discovered by federal executives in this area of asset management. And before we get into the really exciting work that the architect of the Capitol is doing, and then the follow-up on how the GAO is encouraging asset management through its reports. We can't say enough about the GAO's 19-57 report on federal facility asset management and how that just opened the gates for so many federal agencies to come and talk with us and presented our programs. That was really helpful. But we want to give a little overview of asset leadership. So Jim, welcome. How are you doing today? Jim Dieter?
Yeah, I'm doing great, except for my cold. So,
Oh, sorry to hear you have a cold.
yeah, no problem. All right.
Jim's got the bringing up slides look on his face.
Indeed, indeed. So, just to tell you a little bit about the Asset Leadership Network and how we got to the place to do all the things Mike was talking about. No, went past the first one. I like that slide. Anyhow, just a couple slides from our strategic plan, kind of lay out, who we are and what we're about. And we've had our strategic plan is a work in progress. We change it probably monthly, I guess. I don't know.
We evolve it.
Evolving, right?
Yes.
But it's all about the creation and preservation of sustainable value. Really, we're advocating for asset leadership, which we see as one facet of asset management, along with the asset operations. People actually using the assets, and the asset management part, which we spent a lot of time talking about. But the people here today are awesome representations of leadership in asset management and what that leadership is, and the reasons why they're doing the things that they're doing. Our vision around this, not that we think big, but it's an equitable and sustainable world. We're not afraid to think big, and we've punched above our weight since day one. So we're working on it, and our mission is to inspire people to action as leaders in creating and preserving sustainable value. The value is an interesting question in the development of ISO 55000. There was lots of talk, probably more than on any other topic, about the meaning of value. And people had trouble with that concept if it wasn't a commercial organization where it could be directly monetized, although that's not a simple thing in itself. But in the federal government, what is that sustainable value? And I think that'll be an underlying theme that whether intentional or not, will flow through this. Why are these people doing these things within the federal government, and what is the value that they see from it? So I just love to hear those stories, and it reinforces, why we're all doing these things, and how we can share some of those with others. So just briefly, the things we're focused on are impact, innovation, inclusion, and integrity, which I think comes through in programs like today. But, for the last slide is, what we're doing and what we're trying to do is to inform, inspire, and connect. And I think today's program is a perfect example of doing all three of those things in a way that encourages and promotes asset leadership, asset management, and that sustainable world that I think we're all trying for. So I want to thank everybody that have joined us today to hear this and to be part of the discussion overall, and especially to our panelists that Mike has so ably put together once again. Thanks, Mike. Back to you.
Thank you, Jim. Nick just sent me a note. That's a highlight right there. You should give your presentations while you're sick more often, Jim.
No, good. I like the
It's like Michael Jordan when he got the flu, he won the championship. So now it's my pleasure to bring on Dominic Townsend. Dominic has been a stalwart supporter of the Asset Leadership Network, and welcome back, Dominic.
Thank you, Mike.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Good. Always like hearing about you traveling around the world certifying organizations, and I was never more excited than when I heard that you had certified the architect of the Capitol's John Adams building, Library of Congress, John Adams building. And so we'll let you talk a little bit about that and introduce Byron.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, we were really excited to be a partner of the architect of Capitol, John Adams building, for several reasons. One, they were very focused on driving asset management and life cycle of assets throughout its organization. And also it was the very first federal building that was certified towards ISO 55000 in asset management. So just to be a part of that, and Mike Dunlap's team was just exciting. So, really allowed us to focus with Byron and his group to really make sure that we are understanding what their requirements are, helping them through the process. And then their team did the heavy lift of really driving the certification activities throughout the organization. So, just a little bit about Byron and his background. I believe he's a civil engineer. He holds an MBA, and it's been really exciting to work with him, as well as the rest of the members of the Federal Capitol building. So that was very exciting.
Excellent. Thank you, Dominic. And Byron, we did a test.
Byron, nice to see you again.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. Yeah, it's great to see you as well.
So the test went well, so you should be able to share the screen and go ahead and get the discussion or the presentation started, and then we'll have discussion following.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks, Mike and Dominic. Let me just do the share here. And yeah, let me know if you
We see it now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and as Mike and Dominic said, really, I just wanted to provide kind of a brief snapshot of the architect of the Capitol's journey with respect to the enterprise asset management program and specifically about the ISO certification itself. And with that, just a quick background about the agency itself. The AOC really is a unique agency, a mission of serving Congress and the Supreme Court, preserving America's capital and inspiring memorable experiences. However, the really mission for the agency is much more expansive than that, and the facilities, much of which are historic, are important, to the world and symbolic. And so the facilities that are cared for, it's over 18 million square feet of facilities, as I mentioned, mostly historic. 570 acres of of land and infrastructure and utilities, including a Capitol power plant, and daily building occupants of 30,000 and upwards of 3 million visitors annually. So quite a broad mission and a diverse, I think you'll say, it's a set of assets across the agency as well. So composed of 9 jurisdictions with unique mission and clients across the Capitol complex and beyond, from the Capitol building to the House office buildings, Senate office buildings, Botanic Garden. As I mentioned, just a really diverse set of assets and a historic and symbolic context as well. So every agency, either objective or initiative, starts with some sort of a problem. And I think, like a lot of large agencies, federal agencies, large private organizations as well, often the organization can be siloed, and there might be a difficulty in collecting consistent information across the agency or organization and articulating that into whatever it may be, a budget justification or a need for something. And I think that was realized through just some differences in jurisdictions. Some, not necessarily a jurisdiction doing something bad, but something that may be just inconsistent from one to another that made it difficult to articulate some of these things. And so several years ago, there was an organizational restructuring to try to look at alleviating and mitigating that. And as you know, to also not only bring consistency to jurisdictions and operations and capital planning, but also to really look strategically at the deferred maintenance backlog, as that had been increasing over years. And so with that, there was also 6 strategic objectives or initiatives that were created, one of which was an enterprise asset management program. And really that is intended to get at the root of driving consistency and addressing the deferred maintenance backlog. And with that, just to kind of further expound on some of the program goals, really looking at this vertically aligned set of policies and procedures that govern these major capital investments, and implement industry-leading best practices for lifecycle facility management, which is aligning to ISO 55000 and also achieving certification as well. And so the program itself was really initiated through 3 phases and is of course ongoing. And it's interesting in kind of sharing these experiences and collaborating with other agencies that have either looked to implement an ISO compliant asset management system or gone for certification itself. There's a lot of similarity into these overall phases, where to start from a maturity assessment that might align with the Institute of Asset Management best practices to see where the agency organizational is, and then governance and foundations and building upon that and filling in gaps from that maturity assessment. And so I think it's just funny that there's been a lot of, not necessarily funny, maybe it shouldn't be surprising actually, that there is a similarity and perhaps the strategy to try to implement a program like this. However, I think the one unique part about the Architect of the Capitol was that there was really a drive, an initial objective to identify a scope of the asset management system and bring the asset management system into ISO compliances and take the system through audit and certification, as to build a framework that could then be expanded to the rest of the agency. And sort of that's where we are now, currently, sort of in between that phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 3 really looking more of a tactical implementation and really an expansion of data standards as well. And so, once again, I think this type of figure is something that I've seen a lot in other presentations, and it's really the initial push, the initial drive to build out an ISO compliant asset management system, with focusing on initial, governance, steering committee, what's the scope of the asset management system, developing core documents and processes, such as policy and manual and operation and maintenance procedures, and then other supporting documentations as well, such as the internal auditing process, which is something we're actually going through at the moment. And so just to build upon that, the governance structure itself that has been developed is cross-functional governance structure, starting with the architect himself, with a steering committee really responsible for oversight and direction of the asset management system, as well as the asset management objectives, and keying in on ensuring that they're following the direction that is intended. And then a working group, much more of the tactical arm of the governance structure, looking at developing documents, managing key documents, and reporting on performance as well. And then an enterprise asset management office, which is really sort of my role to try to facilitate this across the agency. And also the EAM objectives for the agency. So, as you can see, really right at the heart of the initial objectives for the asset management program, the intent was really to achieve this ISO certification. And one of the reasons for that is to really understand what it takes to achieve that. What does it mean? What's the level of effort? So we can kind of truly understand what the impact is going to be on expanding a program like this, and how we want to manage a certification as well. So really, what's that level of effort? What does it take? What are the key players involved? And do we have confidence in the framework that's being built out for ultimate expansion? And then some of the other key objectives that you can see there. Having a consistent facility data, as well as developing asset management plans, and then there's some other objectives that are being tracked as well. And so progress to date, really the push for that certification was, wanted to identify a scope. And take the gap analysis that was initially conducted, fill in gaps associated with the clauses and aligning with ISO 55001, and then take through audit and certification. And that ultimate timeline was about 18 months, a little more than that. And really during 2023 was really initial standing up of the asset management system and approval of the strategic asset management plan and asset management plan for the John Adams building, part of library buildings and grounds. And then ultimately achieving the certification, concluding the audit and certification, and earlier this year, for the John Adams building. And so the process itself was, stage one concluded in, at the end of last year, and then we went through the stage two earlier this year. And really that identification of the scope was a key piece of it as well. And there were a number of reasons why the John Adams building, which is the second oldest Library of Congress building right on Capitol Hill, and that was identified as the initial scope for a number of reasons. One, through the maturity assessment, it was identified that library buildings and grounds maybe had a higher degree of maturity associated with asset management practices, just in general, whether it be awareness or knowledge. Just through that entire maturity assessment, that appeared to be where we might want to start with the asset management system. And then the John Adams building, part of the EAM initiative was also to advance the facility condition assessment program from primarily a deficiency-based assessment into aligning with an ASTM uniformat and an inventory for more of a condition-based assessment and data collection. And the John Adams building was the first pilot building that went through that procedure, which is now part of the base, the standard practice for the agency. But so those things coming together, both the maturity piece as well as the data that we had to really develop a coherent asset management plan, drove towards that initial scope. And so really this figure here is just kind of depicting at a really high level what the scope is and the key processes and enabling items that really are a full part of the scope of the asset management system to try to bring that cross functionality together. And then I think ultimately the program itself has had a number of benefits. However, for the certification itself specifically, I think two of the key ones really are the confidence in the asset management system. Now we have a degree of confidence in the framework that was built out at the John Adams building for expansion, and we understand what it takes to go through the audit and the certification process, and really the clauses that are required to really to align to. And so I think that confidence is helpful with developing the lessons learned and the framework for how expansion will take place. And then also the audit preparation itself bridged silos just by its very nature, bringing in the right folks as part of the development of the asset management system, and were key inputs and drivers into the audit preparation and certification. By its very nature, was collaborative and helped with, I think, bridging the silos for developing the asset management system. So just a number of kind of key takeaways from this initial focused scope of the asset management system. And I think we also are very cognizant that this is really a first step. I think it's a big milestone, but it's really just a first step. Expansion and maturity is going to take place over several years, and have its own inherent challenges. And then finally, just to conclude, I know one thing that the enterprise asset management program has also been looking towards and getting some key insight from is the Strategies to Renew Federal Facilities report, that came out not too long ago. And I think we've really looked at these recommendations and tried to make some strides for these recommendations, particularly the first four. So that's really what I wanted to share. Mike, thanks for the opportunity, and appreciate the time.
Well, wow, we could go in about 3 separate directions from this. First of all, the setup, the structuring of how to approach asset management. Nick had commented that is one of the best explanations of how an organization structured their asset management approach. And so that's one program we want you to come back and talk to us about, the actual hands-on part of it. This is great that it's, the overview, and it shows the broad scope. So thank you very much for that. But anytime you're interested and you want to get into details about, certain areas, then the approach for certification to be involved, we could talk about how you did that. But really, I would like to get started by talking about your setup, how you got involved, and where you're coming from. This is great to see it as an organizational activity, but what got you fired up to accept the position to do this?
Yeah, no, that's fair. At least my background is from the private sector, and so worked in a variety of worked for a variety of clients, both public and private, and often in facility management, developing programs and processes really for asset management. And so, I guess when I saw the position description for the enterprise asset manager, I was very curious. It just kind of sparked an interest, and just because I thought what an interesting agency and an interesting pursuit, and that's what really kind of got me fired up about it. And it had been a lot of facets of things I had done and for other clients in sort of different scopes, and this seemed like a really focused approach for an agency. So I was just drawn to it.
And then the civil engineering we see on a regular basis. That's a good background, but how much has your MBA helped? Because the structure of your presentation is so clear and concise. It seems like it's benefited from that business administration understanding also.
Sure. Yeah. No, I I think it has, Mike. I think, ultimately with the civil engineering background, I felt that technically, I was capable, but perhaps was missing other skills, and that's what kind of drew me to pursuing the MBA. And I think ultimately, certainly from a how to articulate figures and numbers in a meaningful way and provide meaningful justifications for things. I think the MBA kind of helped with being able to communicate that in a more effective manner.
Hey, Byron, there's a question from the audience. Folks are wondering what challenges you might foresee in maintaining certification, and also what type of education and training your staff might want to keep up to date.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think we've certainly had some challenges. I mean, I think certainly one of the key the a key requirement that I see in a successful program like this is certainly the leadership buy-in, the leadership commitment, and I think that's probably not surprising, and that's certainly a similar takeaway to other organizations I've talked with, such as NIPA and Hydro Ottawa, King County Metro, other agencies and organizations that have kind of really embraced this path. And I think the leadership buy-in is truly critical. And so with a government agency and turnover, and change, I think I think there are just inherent challenges moving a program like this forward, just as well as just expanding across the agency. I think a big piece, certainly a real mission critical part of the AOC is operations. So operations of these very critical facilities, and that's the focus, and it has to be. And so I think it's very sometimes I think it will be. I mean, it will be a challenge to expand the program with everybody so busy, so resource constrained in completing their just day-to-day tasks as it is. I think that's inevitably a major challenge.
That is the challenge with everything, actually.
Sure.
And it is odd that asset management is an activity that is going to help address those issues of being too busy to achieve mission success, but it's a matter of how to get it inserted just enough. Now, you mentioned gap analysis. You mentioned a bunch of things, and it would be good to understand what the gap analysis revealed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that probably could be a conversation, certainly in and of itself. But I think that gap analysis, occurred before I started. But
Okay.
I did have an opportunity to review it, and it was part of, what ultimately was done is that once a scope was identified for the initial asset management system and scope in the John Adams building, a much more rigorous, I won't say, well, yeah, a much more rigorous review was taking place of direct clauses and who was sort of involved in clauses
Yes.
and responsible for it, a review against really compliance. And so that much more rigorous review did consume some of the information from the maturity assessment, which was much more high level. But I think what was really key about that more in-depth view is that it really identified key points that needed to be addressed for compliance, and sort of gaps in the overall flow of continual improvement and having a feedback loop within different processes. So I think that was really that was really key. But the high level gap analysis was also important, but that was kind of that was a really first step. And I think what was identified from that is the folks that are key in managing these facilities and operations and the jurisdictions, we're really keenly aware, I think, of some of the issues across the agency, and so that I think that was reflected in that high level gap analysis, and it also allowed us to have kind of a better understanding of things like understanding of software, and that an asset management system isn't an IT software, right? Software supports the asset management system, so I think things like that, and that's always a key point in really what the program is trying to accomplish.
Okay, so a couple of other questions. One that I can answer myself. Who issued the certification? That was Chris Golly who asked that question. And it was ABS Quality Evaluations. Dominic Townsend is the president of that. And Dominic can come in and talk more about that. Dominic, can you talk a little bit about the certification process? Because one of the great things, I'm so excited about what the architect of the Capitol is doing, but making public this certification of the building to help others understand what the process is. So can you explain a little bit about how the architect of the Capitol approached you, or just how that goes?
Well, it came from, the initial inquiry from Byron and his team, really wanted to talk through about, what can asset management certification do for them, which is on top of, already what they're doing as their initiative to drive asset management throughout the organization. And, the one thing that I always talk about is, okay, the certification will keep you into a certain process and allowing you to continually improve the organization as we go out and have a third-party view of the activities that are going on. But the one key here that Byron and his team really did well was not working towards the standard, but the standard working towards the asset of their program. So they really understood what the scheme meant, and how can they look at their processes and their procedures and the training of their people to develop a really robust program that allowed them to really drive efficiency throughout their organization. So that was the key there. And then Byron already hit it on he had leadership commitment, but also the employee base that was involved in the activities. They really embraced certification. They understood the reasons why they wanted to do it, and drove a lot of the benefits out of the certification process. So it was exciting to work with Byron and his team, because they were doing it for the right reasons. They really saw the benefit of becoming certified and becoming a much more, I would say, futuristic organization within the government.
Excellent. So Chris has another question, but Byron, before we get to that, can you build on what Dominic was saying, and who was involved in the certification process at the John Adams building? Is there a person who's in charge of that building? Are there staff that had to be questioned? Did you have to have training with them? What was that process like?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. So really early on, once we'd identified the John Adams building as, I think, the key candidate for the initial asset management system, we had a lot of conversations with, from the superintendent, the deputy superintendent, and assistant superintendent were really kind of the initial key leadership drivers, I think, at the jurisdiction. And then, of course, a lot of other folks across the agency and within the library buildings and grounds jurisdiction to really make it a success. But I think that communication certainly started early on. Once we'd identified that, and as soon as we were conducting the initial facility condition assessment, that was the uniformat based, kind of condition based, part of the conversation was, this is the building we want to kind of use as the basis for developing the initial template for an asset management plan, and what sort of analysis and condition we were looking at to put a really robust 10-year forecast together for repair needs. And I think once again that communication started rather early, and how we can leverage that data to both map out capital needs, but also leverage some of the operations data to make sure that we kind of blend that in a realistic forecast.
And I loved how you said that this is a first step. So did you go through this certification process, documenting it and somehow recording it so that you would know how to go about doing this with the other buildings and assets?
Yeah, yes, we did. So, ultimately, both in the process for establishing the asset management system, and then preparing for the audit, and then going through the audit, we really did have a good look back upon the conclusion and develop a lessons learned document that really maps out some of the um, really some of the positive and some of the negative, and maybe
Challenges, we call
some of the places, right, challenges,
them.
and some of what maybe we can do better next time. One of which was certainly advanced communication to all the key stakeholders. I mean, I think you probably can't communicate sort of early enough, but uh, I think that was a key point, is really understanding um, the commitment to do something like this, and not impact operations, but make this a benefit as opposed to just another task that needs to be accomplished.
Excellent. So what were some of the things that you were looking at in the John Adams building? It wasn't, the roof system. It wasn't whether the windows are leaking. What were the things that you were focused on?
Yeah, yeah. So initially, actually, the objective for certification was one system. So being, like you said, it could be maybe we just look at roofs, or we just look at exterior enclosure, and we develop an asset management plan, and we work through the process with just one system. But I think ultimately, once we really got into the data that came out of the facility condition assessment, I think we realized that it might be more beneficial to look at the entire building from, roof, mechanical, electrical, and engage, because through the FCA process, we engaged the shop personnel to make sure that we have key insights from the folks really performing the maintenance on the facilities, and had a document that could really convey that. So then the scope, we decided to do the entire building. And I think that also is a more applicable framework for the rest of the agency as well. Is not that it's all buildings. I think we realize that goes back to one of the other questions about challenges. I think getting our arms around the civil site and the utility side will be a challenge, just
You
because.
got a train system going underground there too.
Exactly. So there's some certainly unique infrastructure, a lot of which is aging or aged, and that I think will be, present challenges. But I think the building framework was good, and applicable, and something that we can leverage for expansion.
Excellent. So the other question Chris Golly had was, who do you know who did the gap analysis before you showed up? Was that the committee or yeah?
Yeah, we I guess who I think, if we mean sort of like a what contractor maybe supported that effort.
Oh, okay.
If that, I guess, so yeah, when the strategic initiative was first established, there was the office of the chief engineer. The chief engineer was the one sort of that was spearheading the, quote unquote, what we refer to as the big rock lead. And it was really overseen by the chief engineer, but the deputy chief engineer was really day to day looking at how to build this program out, and establishing some of the resources necessary for it. And one of that first steps was to engage and have kind of a gap analysis to further inform how the program develops. But so over the course of the past 2 to 3 years, there's been a series of of contractors that have kind of supported that effort, from from Atkins Realis to Woolpert and AMCL, supporting kind of different facets as this is advanced.
Excellent. And we know that Guidehouse is in there now with some asset management training and other
That's right.
initiatives too. There was another question about training. So can you talk a little bit about that training program since I brought it up? It's one of the most extensive asset management training programs that we've seen.
So yeah, I mean, right, I can yeah, certainly provide a little insight there. So, as part of the initial asset management system, we really had some training on core stakeholders that were really going to be engaged, or clause owners is what we referred to as part of that asset management system. And then also in the past have had some web-based training, and I think we found some of that to be useful, but some of that training on sort of ISO and asset management can be rather dense, and maybe focused on achieving some asset management certification, which is good, but it's I think certainly what Guidehouse is looking to provide is really more of a hands-on sort of approach to how this is useful and how to develop an asset management system, and kind of who needs to be involved, and how training from experience, as opposed to really training for some sort of certification.
Understood. So one of the things that I really liked, actually got excited about, was how the John Adams building already had gone through processes of adhering to consensus standards that exist in the public realm. And that was one of the reasons why it was prepared to move forward with an asset management approach. And the fact that you're looking at these other standards even before you got to asset management, I think is perfect, because the asset management standard is not trying to be everything. It's just trying to help you keep everything aligned properly. And how do you think that the fact that the John Adams building had gone through some ASTM processes, I believe you said, how did that contribute to being ready for asset management?
Yeah, so really that came out of sort of initially part of the maturity assessment involved a couple of key reviews of processes. One of them was looking at the capital improvement plan process, and another focused look was at software as well, and how data is used across the agency. And so one of the recommendations that came out of that was to align with, more of an inventory standard for facility condition assessment, and aligning with a standard. So the ASTM uniformat standard is really just a classification system. And so to classify by group, whether it's the foundation through, G, civil site utilities, and building that kind of catalog down to different levels. And so, assets fall within a particular classification, and it can be customized to a certain level and degree, based on what perhaps the critical focus is. And so, I think what that process helped to do is to advanced the facility condition assessment to help also collect and update data that resides in our CMMS for operations, but also to provide some degree of consistency. So if we go to a different vendor, even for FCAs, at least we have a standard that we're aligning to with respect to classification, and condition as well. So I think what it really helped us do is look at that data and forecast based on condition instead of just, perhaps remaining service life or something like that. So it was really I think it was a key enabler in pushing forth the asset management program. But also it's been I think, as I mentioned, now it's the it's the standard for how we do facility condition assessments at the agency as well. So it just so happened that the John Adams building was sort of, we try to do facility condition assessments every 5 years, and that was on the list to do in that particular year. So it aligned well with how we wanted to, pursue and expand the program.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That helps clarify things. And I love it when you start getting into ASTM specific numbers anyway. So in addition to communicating more and earlier, what were some of the lessons that you learned going through the certification process?
I think there were quite a number, but that's true. I think the big one was, I think, the advanced communication piece, but there were some others in insofar as how many stakeholders were really key to this, and I think it speaks to the cross-functional nature of an asset management system. And so I think I think the big one was that although we tried to limit the scope to something that was achievable and yet applicable for expansion in developing a framework, it still involved obviously stakeholders and processes outside of just the library, buildings, and grounds. And so I think although once again it's a small scope of the agency, it still required a lot of key insight from folks across the agency. And I'm not sure how much that was realized in advance of really going down the road of preparing for an audit and certification.
So in the many years that we've had federal executive speaking, one thing that stuck out was when the Air Force, Russell Weniger, said, we're 10, 15 years into what's a 25 to 30-year process. And I was like, okay, that finally drove home to me the scope of what doing asset management means. You don't do it 1 year and say, okay, we've done asset management and move on. I think, based on what you've said, those numbers look about right for the architect of the Capitol.
Right. And, I think, as I mentioned before, the fact that this really is a first step, I think that's, well said about sort of the notion of how long it's really going to take. And I think, we do want to be realistic for, making this type of expansion a success, and the knowledge that it's going to take some time.
Okay. So the flip side of the, what did you learn? What were the benefits? Have you seen any benefits from going through it? Any aha moments, even before the just maybe even in preparation for the certification?
Well, certainly the preparation for the certification helped to understand, gaps that maybe the agency has, whether it be from a policy perspective, or, I'd say a big one was the sort of the real property inventory and how the agency manages real property. The AOC is a little unique because it's a legislative branch agency, so it does not necessarily align with or comply with Federal Real Property Council guidance and have at least the same federal real property reporting as executive branch agencies. And so I think there's, the way that real property is managed just from a data perspective is a little bit different. And so I think that there was a realization that we should maybe look at aligning with Federal Real Property Council guidance, and that can also support in just the attributes that are kept at the data level. What's the replacement value of these facilities? not always easy to get replacement values or estimate replacement values for these types of facilities, historic in nature. So I think it's informed, the overall process has informed kind of needs that we might need to look at in other areas, just to help with the management of the agency and facilities.
That explains your shout out to the National Academy's strategies to renew federal facilities, which we've got to give a shout out to Jack Dempsey, one of our board members, was a driving force in the creation of that. So that makes a whole lot of sense now. You were looking to the executive branch reporting processes just to help you understand what could be used and what you needed to do different.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, I think we've been, collaborated with other groups as well, in trying to really, and other agencies to kind of understand where, what other agencies have done and how, and successes and perhaps failures or challenges. So I think, try to be collaborative and how this is pulled together, and learn from lessons of others, even in things like we talked about the uniformat classification. I mean, we looked at how the DoD manages assessments and brings data together, and the catalog that they use for their framework for operations and CMMS. And so we've really tried to look at what other agencies have done, and try to build this in an appropriate manner that is right sized and focused for the AOC.
Well, that's excellent comment to make on an asset leadership network program. That's what we've been trying to do, is provide this platform. We mentioned Bob Leach earlier when he was at the Army Corps of Engineers giving the first ALN. His team gave them the first ALN federal agency presentation on how they're approaching ISO 55001, and that was back in 2015. And Bob's a senior fellow, and Woolpert was involved at one point with you. So, and you got Jack Dempsey's and the National Academy, the National Strategy, the strategies to renew federal facilities involved, and you are networking. You're doing it all. So we thank you for
no, and very early on, as you mentioned, I mean, we collaborated with the Federal Asset Management Working Group as well to get some of those key insights with the, I know at that time, I think the Army Corps just kind of completed the Strategic Asset Management Plan, which was a huge milestone for their organization. So that's certainly something we had kind of talked through and was helpful in as we progressing the program itself.
Yeah, they did that in 2021. They published that, and we've got Peter Dojian speaking tomorrow to continue that tradition of giving the platform for executives to talk about what they're doing on the federal level, but also to ask each other questions. And so there's a panel tomorrow that will be doing some of that. So really, thank you so much for this presentation, for the work that you're doing. And that's a perfect setup for our next panel. But before we go into introducing those, just thank you, round of applause. Really appreciate what you're doing, and that you take time. There's Nick coming on to actually give the applause.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike and Nick. Appreciate the opportunity, and looking forward to future collaboration and discussion.
Yeah, well, we got to pick a time that isn't right after a critical election, and maybe we can do something on Capitol Hill with you, because I think the way you've laid things out is really a good example. We talk enough with other federal executives that looking at what you're doing in a hands-on way will be very beneficial for the other agencies. So thank you very much, Byron.
All right. Thank you.
So as I was saying, that's a perfect lead in to the U.S. Government Accountability Office presentation, because I've got to say, I think it was the GAO 19-57 report that on federal facility asset management that really opened up the floodgates of federal agencies being interested in asset management. And we're very happy to have Amelia Shachoy, who was the convener, or not exactly sure what the proper title is of the person who runs that report, but Amelia ran that, and she is uh, stalwart of the Asset Leadership Network, and she's now a writer with Woolpert, and she's going to facilitate a series of presentations from the GAO. Thank you for joining us, Amelia.
Yes, it's good to see you all. I'm going to introduce three assistant directors from GAO. We all work together in the physical infrastructure team at GAO, which handles all types of physical infrastructure, but in particular, what we are going to focus on is federal real property. And that's the work that Keith and Crystal and Kyle do, and the work that I did for my last 10 years at GAO. So I think the order is that Kyle is going to speak about a report on climate vulnerabilities, and then Keith is going to speak about building utilization, and Crystal is going to speak about a report on an office sharing pilot. So I'll hand it over to them, and then I have some questions that I'd like to ask, and then I'm sure the audience will have some questions also.
Thanks, Amelia. I think I'm going to go first. And Crystal, thank you so much for handling the slides. My name is Kyle Browning. As Amelia said, I'm an assistant director at GAO, and it's my first time here. I'm very happy to be here. Compared to some other folk, everyone here probably relatively new to this issue area and to the topic of asset management. But one thing I've already learned in my limited experience in this topic is that agencies and organizations are regularly confronted with new and emerging issues, climate change, pandemics, that hopefully their asset management processes are prepared to address, but sometimes require maybe changes to those asset management processes. So we thought we'd kind of cover three recent GAO reports that talk about some emerging issues that agencies are confronting as they manage their space and their assets. So I think we can go to the second slide, Crystal. So the context for this review that I'm going to talk about is some things that I think you all know, but I think are worth stating as a baseline, which is that climate-related events and other natural hazards present huge risks to federal agencies' management of their real property. They can impose substantial costs. Climate change and natural disasters have cost the federal government billions of dollars in recent years. This graphic isn't necessarily cost of the federal government, but just illustrates a snapshot of 1 year of huge disaster that have those kind of costs. And so limiting the federal government's exposure by better managing climate change risks has been a GAO high risk area since 2013, in part because of the federal government's role in owning and operating a lot of infrastructure. Related, but in a somewhat distinct topic, is that agencies' management of real property can also affect communities where these properties are located. Adverse health and environmental conditions, like the risks from climate change or natural disasters, can in some cases disproportionately burden some communities. So concerns about these disproportionate burdens have led to environmental justice efforts. So this report that I'm talking about does talk about environmental justice in addition to climate vulnerabilities. So again, a little more context before I get into our report, but I think it's worth mentioning that we had a report right before this that actually Amelia led that looked at how selected agencies have incorporated natural disaster resilience into their assets and asset management. That report found that agencies were taking some limited actions to incorporate resilience into their asset management. But if I could summarize it maybe too simplistically, this wasn't really a deeply ingrained part of agencies' asset management yet. Subsequent to that, and in some ways in response to our report, the Disaster Resiliency Planning Act was enacted in December 2022. And this, among other things, required OMB to issue guidance to require agencies to consider climate change and resilience as they carry out their real property asset management. So we from GAO thought, of course, that was a good thing. That was something that we thought agencies could do better at, and OMB could take some leadership on. So that happened. And so now we can get into a little of what we found in this report. So I think we're on slide 3 now. So the bottom line of the most recent report we put out on this is that agencies are doing better. They're doing more to think about and address climate vulnerabilities and environmental justice as part of their asset management. So the first part of our report talked about how do you even identify climate vulnerabilities? How are agencies doing that? The real quick answer is that they're using federal tools and data to identify their vulnerabilities and their environmental justice considerations that are appropriate for their agencies. These are tools that, and I can talk about this more maybe in the discussion point. These are tools that include data, interactive graphics, maps, and other things that show past and projected climate conditions. Agencies can overlay their own data onto that and then sort of get a sense of what their vulnerabilities are. Additionally, among the agencies review, we reviewed the processes at 13 different agencies. They're also using these tools to identify environmental justice considerations. They specifically called out the climate and economic justice screening tool, which I'm happy to talk about more if people don't know what that is or want to talk more about it, but that's a tool that is available to agencies. That's sort of a geospatial mapping tool that allows them to overlay data with disadvantaged communities. And this has really helped them identify where they need to be thinking more about environmental justice considerations. The challenge, or I know there's a lot, but one challenge that came up pretty consistently when we went through agencies' identification of climate vulnerabilities and stuff is there's a lot of tools. How do we pick among all these tools, and what data can we trust, and how do we know what to do and what data to incorporate into our asset management? And luckily, there's been some action to help with that in the last couple of years. I won't go into depth on all of this, but for example, the White House's Office of Science and Technology policy issued guidance that provided some information for federal agencies to help select among these resources and tools. The OMB guidance that I mentioned from the law in December 2022, that came out in November 2023. That OMB guidance also helps agencies pick, it first identifies a lot of these tools, also helps agencies pick what might be appropriate for them and provides some guidance on, evaluating the data. Just anecdotally, we've seen that sometimes these tools are very good, but the data doesn't reflect what's happening right now. You can look at what happened with the hurricane in Western North Carolina. Some of those flooding were things that were never anticipated by existing tools and maps on climate projections. So evaluating the data and the tools is an important thing for agencies to be doing as well. So next slide, I think, slide 4. The next thing we looked at was sort of, okay, now that you've, as an agency, identify what your vulnerabilities might be, how do you incorporate that into asset management? And again, as a high level, quick summary that maybe we can go in more depth on during discussion is that agencies are, all 13 that we talked to, are incorporating climate vulnerabilities as one factor among others into their existing real property asset management processes. As you all probably know, what this often involves for agencies is ranking potential investments and incorporating climate vulnerability among other factors is something agencies are doing now pretty consistently. Again, something that we're looking for agencies to be doing, and we saw sort of at all 13 agencies that we looked at. As a side note, we didn't make this part of our report evaluative, in large part because this space was evolving in real time as we were doing this audit work, primarily because the law had just passed requiring agencies to do this. Some agencies were already doing it, but some were sort of ramping it up. OMB guidance hadn't come out yet, so we sort of wanted to just do a snapshot of where agencies were rather than evaluate them based on a moving target. So as a side note, it might go without saying, but another thing we heard as part of this part of the report was that, of course, other considerations can conflict sometimes with agencies' efforts to address climate vulnerabilities. Sometimes mission criticality for a facility or an asset can trump any climate mitigation efforts that an agency might want to do, or there might be health and safety alterations or considerations that an agency deems are more important. That's part of a normal part, I think, of the asset management process, is to weigh different competing priorities. But we certainly didn't hear that agencies were able to or even willing to address all climate vulnerabilities for their asset management. So that, frankly, would be an unrealistic goal anyways. And then next slide, slide 5. With respect to environmental justice considerations, we also heard that agencies are identifying considerations and trying to incorporate that into their asset management as well. I would characterize this as less developed than the agency's climate vulnerability work. For example, what we heard agencies most often doing was altering and changing and enhancing their NEPA requirements. So as many of you probably know, NEPA requires environmental reviews agencies to carry out for a lot of investments in construction. And there's things that agencies can do through that to try to address environmental justice considerations. So just as a quick example to try to make this sort of maybe nebulous concept more concrete, we heard from the Department of Homeland Security that it had updated its instruction manual for implementing NEPA at the agency. And what it specifically started to require their employees to do and the processes to carry out were outreach efforts to populations affected by investments, by new construction or renovations or things like that. And they also use those tools I mentioned before to identify any disadvantaged or overburdened populations that might be affected by things and ensure that they're reaching out, they're getting their input, and potentially altering plans in response to that input. And the last thing I'll say on this is that, again, in the course of our work, GSA issued a final rule in April 2024 that describes the factors that federal agencies should consider when making location decisions for federal facilities. And one of those factors is environmental justice considerations. So it says specifically in this new rule that agencies should seek to minimize negative and maximize positive impacts in communities affected by environmental justice concerns. I think agencies are probably still grappling with that and figuring out how they're going to implement that. But that was another emerging requirement that we saw in response to this environmental justice concern. So I'll leave it at that. Hopefully I can talk a little more in response to some questions later, but I think I'll pass it over to my colleague.
Hey, everybody. Kyle, thanks a lot. You might be the new kid on the block, but I am the opposite of that. I think I've known Mike and Jack and Amelia doing ALN events for maybe a decade now. Is that possible, Mike?
Yeah, it's more than possible.
It feels like a decade.
It could be more than a decade, Keith, is why I say it's more than possible.
Well, great. Happy to be here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about our utilization work from last year. Got some attention. I want to start off just by putting it in context. One of our big reports that comes out every 2 years is the high risk list. It has 24 of the most significant issues facing the federal government related to fraud, waste, abuse, or mismanagement. Federal property management has been on that list almost since the beginning, since 2003. It can get a drink in a bar starting this year, 21 years old. And underutilized property has always been one of the reasons why it's been on the high risk list. People think of telework and remote work, but we've been talking about underutilized property now for 21 years. It was only in 2023, though, that we actually started tracking underutilized buildings. In the past, we've always talked about fully vacant buildings. They're the ones that are easy to know. The Federal Real Property Profile is the government-wide database, and it very conveniently lists when buildings are vacant. And so we've been able to track that for 21 years. But knowing when buildings are only partially utilized, a lot trickier. Subject, next slide. So we picked 24 cabinet level agencies. These are all the big ones. Any big agency you think of, and a couple little ones were included in this study. These buildings are massive buildings. They average over 1 million square feet and 60 years of age. So they're big and they're old. Why did we pick these buildings? Mostly because the agencies had data on them. Quite frankly, agencies before the pandemic did not really track the number of people going into their buildings. Many of them didn't even have to go through like a turnstile. This was all new, but most agencies wanted to know how many people were going into their headquarters building. So that there's data there. The other big reason was these are office buildings, and understanding how many people could be using an office building is a fairly known quantity. How many people should be using a laboratory or a clinic? It's a lot tougher accounting, and I wanted to keep it as simple as possible for our first study. Next slide. And here it is. You always say, one of my favorite quotes is, I would have written you a shorter letter if I had more time. And so I spent a year to basically create this figure. This is the figure of all the buildings and how much they're utilized. You might notice that they're broken down by quartile. In the report, you can see which agencies fit in each one of these utilization quartiles. But not which one is the lowest and not which one is the highest. And that was one of the caveats that we put in the report to get agencies to participate. People think we have a lot of power. GAO has zero power. I have to beg and plead for agencies to help me, give me data, give me access. We have, the abilities to force them to subpoena stuff, but I don't think we've used it in the 26 years I've been at GAO. So we're not going to use it here. So I had to convince agencies to share the utilization data, how many people are going into these buildings on a daily basis. The only way I could do it was with two qualifications. One, I had to collect it from everybody. No picking one. Usually we'll pick a selected number of agencies, and it had to be everybody. We had to all hold hands and jump at the same time. And the second one is no naming and blaming. No saying who's the worst and who's the best. So my tricky way of doing that was to do the quartile analysis, and it worked. And so what does this say? It says that all federal agencies are having problems utilizing their buildings right now. It wasn't surprising anyone, but I think that most people were surprised by the scale of the issue. The average is 25%, and we're topping out at under 50%. Like the most used federal headquarters building was only 46%. Next slide. The causes are many. First of all, it's been a problem forever. 21 years, but I'm sure the problem goes back more than 21 years. Second, buildings are not configured for maximum utilization. I have a couple pictures here of the HUD building. And as you can see, for the most part, a lot of the space was just hallways, and they just weren't configured to be used. A lot of them are from an era in the past where you had big libraries and areas for paper storage and secretary space, and a lot of space that just doesn't have a current use. And yes, a lot of federal workers are telecommuting right now, a lot more than they used to before the pandemic. Next slide. So we didn't formally apply the asset management framework that Amelia developed when she was at GAO. But I did look at GAO 1957 when I was planning this report and when we were coming up with our findings. And in a lot of ways, I'm going to make an argument that we did apply Amelia's framework. And they come out in the challenges that agencies are facing. The first one is the budget and resources. As you know, you have to maximize the value of your assets. And in order to do that, agencies are struggling to come up with the money. Reconfiguration, consolidation takes money to save money. And that was the number one thing that agencies said was the challenge to increasing utilizations of their buildings. The second one speaks to leadership support. There were concerns about in-office attendance policies. And we're talking about 4.5 years later. Agencies are still waiting for the other shoe to fall and everybody to be marched back into the office. And they're worried that the day after they consolidate or release space, they're going to have to find space for everybody once again. This election, we'll see what happens. I understand this reluctance, but it's at a certain point, you can't just keep waiting. You have to take an action and deal with the consequences if they come later. The third one deals with a collaborative culture, which is another one of the asset management framework issues. Agencies are reluctant to share in a number of ways. None of the agencies had a robust hoteling or hot desking or desk sharing policy. So everybody had their own dedicated space, and they really had no way of doing anything else. Second of all, agencies had individual silos within their agencies. The Department of Commerce has 14 different silos of different bureaus, each of which gets their own space that they decide how to allocate, and they are the ones that get to use. We're talking about secure space like SCIFs. We're talking about even conference rooms. Like this is NTIA's conference room. And so you had to break down those silos and create a more collaborative culture. And then another step up is sharing within the federal government. If you really want to get efficiencies of scale within real estate, you're going to have agencies sharing with agencies. You're going to hear about Crystal's report next, and this is what I really think is the future of federal property is co-working space. Agencies which have consistent missions or can work together in an administrative area. Every agency does not have to have an auditorium. They could share an auditorium. I even believe they can share SCIFs and secure spaces. And then the last one is dealing with quality of data and policies and plans. Agencies did not know how to measure utilization. The old method was very simple. How many people were assigned to the building times 150 or times 180 square feet, and that's how much space you needed. But that assumes everybody's going in every day. And everybody has not been going in every day for quite a while now. And so you need to have another way of measuring. And OMB was able to address that problem almost immediately after our report. They got to work with the Federal Real Property Council to develop a new benchmark for space. And I have it written down here. It's a pretty simple thing. It's everybody gets 150 square feet per person going into the building. And what we're shooting for is 60% utilization, at least 60%. So on any given day, 60% of the workspaces are occupied. And they have a long runway for rolling this out. A lot of agencies aren't ready. Next August, they'll be coming up with their plans for how they're going to implement it. And then a year from then, we're actually going to start measuring in 2026, measuring utilization. Do I have another slide? Yes, I do. So we have some ongoing studies that are going to further this work and look a little bit deeper. Right now, we're looking at shadow space. If you understand how GSA manages its federal footprint, agencies rent effectively from GSA, whether GSA is renting from a building owner or from the federal government, they go through GSA. And so agencies, if they no longer need it, they don't necessarily return it to the building owner, they return to GSA. And then GSA is responsible either for canceling that lease or backfilling it if they have a lot more firm term left. If federal building, it's even more so. GSA has to try to find a backfill tenant. But as buildings partially empty out, agencies return the space and GSA is struggling to find tenants. And so it's going to require them to consolidate partially occupied buildings into full buildings and then dispose of the ones they don't need anymore. We're looking at that. And the other report that we're doing starting right now is a deep dive into the Department of Transportation and all of its modal administrations. So we're going to take a look at that department see what are the utilization, what's the utilization of all of its buildings, all of its office buildings, what are the costs of maintaining unutilized space, and what are the consolidation opportunities that could be realized, and how much money could they save by doing that. And so I think that is all I have today. And Crystal, ready to tell us about some co-working space?
Such a great handoff. And like Keith mentioned, there are a lot of a lot of nice dovetailing from the utilization question to the co-working question. So yeah, I'm going to talk about our report that came out in September of this year, looking at GSA's co-working pilot program, which was launched in part in response to increased telework and underutilization of federal office space. GSA started this pilot program in July of 2023, and it is still ongoing. And through the pilot program, basically federal employees can access kind of shared co-working office space in 6 federally owned or leased locations across the country. And you can see that in that map here. At the time of our review, and I believe this is still the case, the space was free to use. So federal employees would contact GSA, note that they were interested in using the space at one of these locations. GSA kind of gives them a kind of introduction on the first day of how to use the space, and then people can kind of show up after that. GSA does ask that folks sign in, and we'll talk a little bit more about this and kind of the issues that came up here. And GSA uses that data, the sign-in data, to calculate usage and then also send a survey basically out to folks after the fact to kind of get a sense of what were their impressions of the co-working space. Did they have any suggestions or needs that weren't addressed there? We were auditing the pilot program in real time, which presented some interesting challenges because it was evolving, and GSA was kind of thinking through how they wanted to do this pilot. But they were super helpful and very open to speaking with us. Overall, what I'm going to talk you through and what our report looked at was how GSA identified and addressed, and what did they find with respect to agencies' needs for co-working spaces, any kind of opportunities and challenges presented by co-working, and how GSA might be addressing some of those challenges. And then the extent to which GSA's pilot kind of met these key characteristics that GAO has previously identified for a good kind of pilot program design, basically. Let me drive my slides too. So yeah, for the co-working space feature, so GSA took some steps before they officially opened and launched these pilot locations to understand what would drive people to use the co-working spaces, what would agencies find useful, what would the users find useful. They did focus groups, they did workshops, surveys. They contracted with a real estate services company to understand how does this work in the private sector. And I should note that GSA was doing all of this with practically no budget for the pilot program. So they were really leveraging existing resources. Like Keith said, what space do we already own or lease that we could, easily set up as a co-working space? Can we use some GSA staff on site to help people use these spaces, things like that? So you can see some examples here. And basically what GSA found in terms of what users and agencies thought were important are kind of fall into basically a few categories. One is technology. So obviously Wi-Fi, but also access to shared printers. I'm sure all of us who work at home understand that. Also rooms with audio and video conferencing capabilities, things like that. The other one was varying space types. So not just, an individual workstation, but also team rooms. If a bunch of people are coming in and they want to have a meeting, there's options for that. Also, even as Keith said, much bigger rooms, conference spaces, training rooms. You can see that in the middle photograph down there for the Tacoma space. And just kind of giving people different options depending on what their needs were. Amenities, things you would expect, kitchens. You can see the break room in the lower right side for the Chicago space, having support staff on site to kind of help deal with things, the thermostat's not working, things like that. And then ease of use, which we kind of lumped a few things in, but things like public transit, is it easy to get in and like check in and things like that. And then privacy and security, having private space for phone calls, having secured access, since these are federal spaces, things like that. So GSA did in each pilot location, try to kind of address those needs, and you can see some examples down there. In terms of kind of opportunities for co-working, so the big one, the one that obviously makes sense given everything Keith has been talking about how much space is not being used and that's being paid for, is cost and space savings. And that kind of shows up in three different ways that we talk about in our report. The first one is swing space. You know, your lease is over, you have a new place that you're moving to, but you've got a gap between the two. In the past, agencies might have done lease extensions, which could be kind of costly. The idea is that if there's a co-working space nearby, you know, maybe folks can use that for a few months to kind of address that gap. And we did highlight an example in the report where the National Park Service used the co-working space in San Francisco in between leases and saved about $1.6 million, according to GSA. The other example is surge space. So where agencies need more space than usual in a location they're not normally at, or just like more employees temporarily are coming into the office and they don't have the space anymore to accommodate them. The example here would be FEMA. You know, a disaster happens, people get deployed. Those folks are out in the field doing disaster recovery, but there's also support staff who are working in offices, usually at that site as well, you know, making maps, et cetera. And instead of renting space from a non-government agency, if GSA had a co-working space available, you know, those employees could go there. The other example is, you know, maybe an agency reduces its office space, but let's say IRS tax season, a lot more people are coming in. They no longer have the office space to accommodate them. Okay, this can be your backup. And then the last one is kind of this longer term vision where we are, you know, where agencies are actually reducing their dedicated space and they are using the co-working space to address things like I need a conference room today, or, you know, like I said, like we've got more people coming in. Okay, we have this option. Or maybe we're just exclusively using the co-working space now. We don't have dedicated space in a certain field location. The other opportunity that came up was flexibility. So, you know, post-pandemic, people have moved all over the place. Some employees are no longer living near where their agencies have offices. So this could be an option where if you have an in-office requirement, folks can go to a co-working space if there's one where they live. Similarly with recruitment, if you're trying to get people who are not living near where you have offices anymore, this could be an option to give them some space where they can at least work around other people, meet in office requirements, things like that. We heard an example from one agency where they have employees who are consistently doing field work in like North Texas. It's not enough to have a dedicated space for that agency, but they were like, you know, it'd be great if there's a co-working space where they could drop in when they're doing that. And then the last one, Keith mentioned this in terms of collaboration. You know, if you've got agencies with similar missions, maybe there's some knowledge sharing, some synergies that you can take advantage of there. In terms of challenges, so the first one, you know, this is a new effort that GSA has started. We're, you know, a little over a year into the pilot. It's going to take time for agencies to really buy into this, to start packaging it into their space planning. So that's going to take time to achieve. And then in the meantime, GSA, you know, will be accruing some cost running co-working spaces. GSA has taken a couple steps to try to address this. One is a tool to help agencies see, like, this is how much you would save if you use the co-working space in this way. The other tool is to help GSA look at locations and say, okay, we've got, you know, X number of agencies with expiring leases in this location. Would this be a good spot for a co-working space if we can get these agencies on board? The second one, mission and compatibility. You know, we have folks working with classified material. We have, you know, like Keith said, there's NASA folks working in labs. Co-working is not going to make sense for them. But for the kind of high security classified work, GSA has taken some steps to have initial conversations with some agencies about the possibility of having high security co-working, shared SCIFs, things like that, that might make sense. The third challenge is agency culture. I think Keith touched on this as well, and employee preferences. Some agencies like having their dedicated space. They may not want to share. Similarly, some employees like having their dedicated space. They may not want to share. And so GSA is continuing its efforts to really use the pilot to outreach to agencies to get an understanding of how can this be of value to you, to your employees? They've mentioned also maybe having the agencies do some employee surveys within their own agencies to understand what might, you know, tip that balance. The last one is uncertainty about co-working. And again, this kind of ties to that first challenge, right? This is early on. Right now, it's free to use. It's not always going to be. GSA has been working with OMB to figure out what is our pricing structure going to be? How are we going to charge agencies for, employees using this space? And I think until that's done, there's still going to be a lot of question marks for the agencies as to whether we're going to do this. And then we also found some agencies weren't aware of the pilot, even though GSA has taken efforts to present on it, to market it. So GSA, is working to have more meetings with agency decision makers, folks who are making the space planning decisions, to increase awareness about it as well. Let me go to the next slide. Okay, and then I mentioned that we also evaluated the pilot program in its current iteration against some prior practices that we had established for, what makes a good pilot design. And overall, we found that of the 5, GSA is aligning or partially aligning with most of them. They have measurable objectives for the pilot. They're really trying originally in the initial kind of iteration to understand, how many people are using it, why are they using it, using those kind of check-in surveys to figure out that information. They do have regular stakeholder communication externally. They have been marketing, they have been meeting with agency decision makers. They have monthly meetings with the GSA staff that are running these co-working spaces to get feedback on, what's working, what's not working. They have an assessment methodology, and we did have a partial alignment here because part of that assessment methodology is using those check-in surveys and getting that feedback on that. But it does require that people check in, right? They like scan a QR code basically. And so there were some people who were showing up, they'd already gotten the orientation, so they knew how to use the space, so they would just show up and not check in. I mean, not scan the QR code. So we did make a recommendation that they take steps to make sure they are accurately capturing that usage information, which also affects like how often they're getting surveys responses back as well. The evaluation plan, they're doing annual end of year evaluations. So we did give them a line there. Now the scalability is where we had the does not align. And scalability in this context really refers to what criteria are you using to decide we're going to move beyond the pilot stage, we're expanding to new locations, we're winding it down, like this isn't working, things like that. Like how do you make those decisions and that you're going beyond pilot to kind of more real world implementation? And we found that GSA didn't really have criteria for that. They kind of were more focused on getting this kind of initial, how many people are using it? Do people like the individual spaces? But more at a holistic level, we were saying you need to kind of understand early on how you're going to make that decision to scale, because that also affects how you're designing your pilot, the types of information you're getting. And this is not currently really operating in a real world setting because it's free. So it would be good for GSA to have that understanding of how are we going to make that decision, and are we currently designing the pilot in a way that will help us get that information. So we did make a recommendation there to kind of establish that scalability criteria. GSA did concur with all the recommendations. They've said that they're taking steps to address it. So I think it'll be really interesting to follow this and see what happens, especially once that pricing gets finalized. But yeah, that's what I've got so far. I don't think I have any other slides, so we can take questions on all of these. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Well, thank you all. I think it's a really interesting and very current compilation of reports, and not new, as Keith said, not new issues. These issues have been around for a long time, including the climate, although we may not have studied it, but climate has been an ongoing issue at adapting buildings to meet current needs. So I had a few questions I just wanted to get all of your input on. One of them is, all these reports and previous work all mention data quality as an issue. And that's one of the key characteristics in the asset management framework, that agencies really can't make good decisions without good data, which we've found continually. But I was wondering, do you think that the agencies have the capability, or what would they need in order to improve quality of their data in the different areas that you talked about?
You want me to talk? I'll start. So in utilization, it's we did 24 different agencies. And so there were 24 different ways of kind of tracking how many people were going into the building. But DHS did something interesting. It really helped us with our methodology, actually. They did 3 different ways. They had the number of people who go through a turnstile. They did logons. They can tell where you're logging on from when you're in the network. And they did a little survey when you log on every day. Where are you working today? And then they compared the results. And they were all within 1% or 2 of each other. So they were all as accurate as any other one. And so what that said to us is, if you're counting and you have a way of deduplicating for when people come and go, then you're probably close enough for what we're looking at here, which is quartile percentages. And in the field, it's going to be a lot more challenged. A lot of them don't have turnstiles. They don't have as precise of network login information. But what I say is they can always just ask, if you log on, where are you working today? And what they found is people will tell the truth, because the consequences of not telling the truth can be quite high. So I feel like they do have the capacity, Amelia, to study this and to get information. They don't need these fancy density, like people monitors. They don't need to install complicated turnstiles. They honestly just need to ask their employees on a daily basis and track it.
Right. Sometimes it's not really, you don't really need a complicated methodology. You just need to start doing something differently. What do you, Crystal or Kyle, do you have anything you want to add from your reports?
I think, one of the things that we pointed out in the co-working report was that GSA, because of Keith's report, was working to work with agencies to understand how do we measure utilization, things like that. I think Keith is right that it doesn't necessarily have to be something super fancy. There definitely could be ways to kind of capture usage and things like that. So yeah. Kyle, anything on the climate?
Yeah, I would just add that in addition to the report that I talked about, we had sort of a sister report going on with some different colleagues looking at climate information, climate data. And that's something that agencies can collect to a limited extent, but in many cases require bigger sort of national efforts. And I can put a link in the chat, but this report had some recommendations for Congress actually to establish new organizations and new frameworks across the federal government to, among other things, like establish and maintain a national climate information system, data that agencies can trust and go to when incorporating that information and those vulnerabilities into their asset management. Because if you're trying to make very expensive investments, you want to have sort of reliable climate information, or at least trustworthy climate information. So like I said, I'll put it in the chat right now, but we have another report that kind of talked about that challenge.
Yeah, that's interesting. Crystal, I was wondering on the office sharing pilot, you said that GSA has started to take steps. Do you know what those steps are? Could you say anything about that?
I know that they, one of the recs that I didn't touch upon as much, but one of the things we also made a case for is taking steps to go ahead and start tracking. The national parks example is a nice example of cost savings. It would be nice if they were systematically tracking, how much is it costing GSA to run these spaces, how many savings are attributed to agencies using the space. So they have, I mentioned they have that tool where they help agencies themselves calculate for the specific instance, how much would I save if I used the co-working space versus, my current agency space plan, whatever the default is. And I believe that based on their responses, they are looking to leverage that as like a first step to start more systematically collecting the information on, okay, how many agencies are actually using it in a way that is saving them money?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be important to know. I was wondering, I think in Keith's report, there's the statistic, or one of maybe both of your reports, that more than half of GSA's leases were scheduled to expire between 2023 and 2027. So it seemed like if this office sharing pilot could be expanded, that might allow GSA to give up some of those leases.
Yeah, and I definitely think that it was something that is on GSA's mind because I believe they were the ones that pointed that out to us when we were interviewing them. So they're aware that this could be a really great tool if folks move fast and start committing. And I think Keith had asked me about this number, and so it's leases that have some of those leases do have renewal options available. So it's possible agencies might do the easy thing, which is just renew that option. It's not necessarily all of the leases are done, expired completely. But either way, renewal option or not, like they could get out of the lease. So this could be a really good opportunity to use co-working, assuming things get nailed down and agencies are comfortable using it.
But Crystal,
Yeah.
one of the problems right now is if an agency was making a decision between a new lease or renewal and co-working space, there really isn't a price option. They don't really know what they'd be getting themselves into or how much they'd be committing or saving, right?
Yeah, and I think that's why the uncertainty is a big challenge right now is, what is it going to cost? And Keith, you mentioned everyone's still a little what's going to happen with in-office requirements. Do we really want to get rid of our dedicated space at this point?
So I was wondering, Keith, on your report, the OMB benchmark you mentioned that it's a 60% utilization rate. And I was wondering do you think that's reasonable? Or I know that you found that 17 of the 24 agencies had an average of 25%, but I think even before the pandemic, as you said, it was quite low. And I think I saw a number in your report, like 67% was before the pandemic.
We
So
did not know the percent utilization before the pandemic. Nobody had that benchmark, but I see where you're headed. I think that that 60% allows for a lot of poor configuration.
Mhm.
And so you can have some inefficient buildings and still manage to get 60% utilization. And I think that's what OMB was kind of driving toward. Like, we don't want to commit ourselves to like billions of dollars of building renovations for this benchmark. And so a lot of this was like, let's do the best with what we have. And I think that I don't know if they did any surveying or if they kind of pulled it out of thin air, but I think that they said, well, 60%, they could probably do that with their current configuration. So I actually absolutely think it's doable with sharing, with office sharing, interagency sharing, and probably not intra-agency sharing, but that would be the goal eventually.
Okay. I was wondering if any of the leases that were scheduled to expire, if GSA did let any of them expire in 2023 and 2024.
Yeah. The Department of Education had two big leases here in Washington, D.C. One, if you know Washington, one is Southwest Washington, D.C., and one was just right around North Capitol Street. And they were able to completely close out of one of those leases and cut the other one in half. And it ended up being over 100,000 square feet that were returned to building owners, consolidating just into the headquarters building. Department of Education really leaned into remote work since the pandemic, and they just have a lot fewer people who come to the office at all.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Do you know if GSA has any data on how many leases they gave up?
We're planning work on that exact thing. I would love to know what the situation is. We actually decided to put that work on hold pending what the in-office profile is going to be moving forward, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, right. I was wondering, Kyle, you mentioned there are these different tools there are federal tools, and then there are tools that individual agencies developed. But did you come across any that you thought the agencies found particularly useful or were actively using to make decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I can mention a couple examples. The Department of Energy mentioned, and other agencies mentioned, the U.S. Global Change Research Program's National Climate Assessment. So that really helps agencies identify regional climate risks and impacts. Some agencies also mentioned NOAA's Climate Explorer, which is a tool that also sort of looks at a regional level for future climate projections. The Department of Health and Human Services mentioned the Argonne National Laboratory's Climate Risk and Resilience Portal. This is sort of something that can supplement those regional tools with more specific localized data on flooding risks, heat, wind, wildfire risks that, like I said before, agencies can overlay their own data on in their own facility locations to get a sense of what the risks might be. But yeah, some agencies we talked to also said that those tools are great, but we want to make them a little more, even more tailored to our needs. So for example, the Department of Transportation created their own tool essentially where they overlaid severe weather data from FEMA with their own internal asset management database and some other tools to kind of have a more dynamic tool related to the DOT assets. So a lot of tools available and a lot of agencies being kind of creative and innovative in developing their own tools to get a better understanding of their vulnerabilities.
Yeah, those are some good examples. I was wondering, is there a way to make these tools available? Is there a mechanism? You know, if agencies are looking to develop their own tools, is there a mechanism to either through OMB or through the, you know, one of the other offices you studied, so that agencies could have a resource for looking at them?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are some interagency task force and resources related to this, and we didn't really get into that too much, but you would hope it would come up if appropriate through those mechanisms. We asked a couple agencies, and they said, "Sure, if anyone asks, we'd be happy to share." So hopefully that is playing out in practice, both through those interagency task force and on a more informal basis. But we didn't really get any specific examples of that.
Yeah, yeah, it seems like that would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So I can ask more questions, but Mike, I don't know if you have comments, people asking questions in the chat,
Well,
or if
yeah,
you have comments on your own.
yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you, Amelia, and thank you all. This has come together spectacularly. The GAO has been a leading advocate of asset management, and we're so happy that you continue to see bipartisan value in asset management. And I just wonder if all of you could just comment on how you see how your work is influencing federal asset management or how it can influence federal asset management. It's very clear to me, but if you want to make specific comments on that. Keith, can I put you on the line to
Of course.
go first?
So, asset management for me has always been about bringing the building back to the mission and explaining why you need the building to accomplish the mission. And I think that in today's world, that question is more relevant than ever. With people working remotely, with people coming to the office 1 or 2 times a pay period, whichever 2 weeks, what do they need the building for to accomplish the mission? Do they need the building to accomplish the mission? Because it's certainly a drag on from a cost standpoint. And I think that we are slowly but surely moving from the idea that we need this building because we've always had this building to a situation where they're saying, well, do we? And agencies are starting to look inward a little bit. And why? What do we really need the building for? What do we use the building for? And how much building do we need? So that we can take all the money that we're spending on buildings and put it more toward mission. So for me, it's all about that matching up of infrastructure with mission. And I think that this is really driving agencies to do that.
And just a little plug for the personal property people out there and the fleet people. Of course, the building determines what things are needed inside and what vehicles are needed to support that building. And it's all tied together. But I understand the focus on facilities, and it's important to focus, but also have the wider context. Crystal, I see you smiling. You got anything you want to share?
I was just thinking Keith said it very well, and I think that yeah, to me, I feel like it is going to be an important issue going forward. It's something we're going to have to keep working on. I think having conversations in forums like these, and thank you for having us, I think that's helpful too for us and getting that kind of message out and hearing from you. But yeah, I think Keith covered it really well. I will defer to his statesman knowledge.
Thank you.
Kyle,
Thank
anything
you.
you want to add?
I'll just mention from the climate vulnerability standpoint, something that's obvious, but we're stating that the federal government has buildings everywhere and lots of them. And so they're going to be exposed and have been exposed and will increasingly be exposed to all kinds of natural disasters and climate situations. And so I think that has created a understandable self-interest from agencies of we have to manage this. We have to be thinking about our vulnerabilities for these buildings that are carrying out our important mission, and we got to be proactive about that. And I'm sure agencies are doing that to a wide, in a variety of ways and in a variety of effectiveness. But it struck me during the course of our work that agencies understood the importance of that. And as Amelia said, this has been growing for a long time, this understanding, and
Kyle,
are taking it seriously. Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
Kyle, I just want to say there was a really great article last Wednesday in the Washington Post. This actually is a personal issue too. Apparently, the real estate market has not adjusted to climate change and the risk of climate change, and the most expensive property remains the property most at risk. And these real estate experts have gotten together and are doing a personal property, your personal ownership vulnerability to climate change. And they're like, your property will appreciate massively in the future if you think about climate when you buy your next house. So this is widely applicable.
Yeah, there's a new tool in the last couple of years on Redfin, that real estate website that has climate factors. To that point exactly. Yep.
And Amelia, I'm very interested in your response to this question because you have a freedom to speak now in a way that you didn't have when you were at the GAO.
Response to which question?
The idea of asset management and these studies that the GAO are doing. To me, I clearly see them as asset management studies. And do you see the GAO and the federal government understanding asset management and using the GAO studies? I know a lot of people used yours, and how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, well, GAO, like I said in the beginning, these three I think fit really nicely together, and it's they're current issues, but they're longstanding issues. And yes, I do think federal agencies use GAO's reports, especially because they make recommendations, and the agencies are required to respond to the recommendations and encouraged to implement them. So they have a few years to do that. But and then also GAO has a letter. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's a letter that goes out to agencies on their high priority recommendations. And so that puts even more pressure on the agencies if they haven't responded. So yes, I think federal agencies do use them.
I will say, Mike, it was the utilization study was the most downloaded report for all of GAO in 2023.
Okay.
I think, as you know, Mike, agencies still have a way to go in terms of making the shift from managing assets to asset management and taking a system, management system approach. And we've talked a lot about that on other ALN sessions and at conferences. And that's still, I think, a big challenge for federal agencies. But some of them have made a lot more progress than others.
And I love that this is paired with the architect of the Capitol because they clearly spelled out their structured approach. And it's interesting because I don't believe the architect of the Capitol falls under what the GAO studies. So,
well, actually, GAO does do some work at architect of the Capitol.
oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
It's highly specialized, though.
Right. Legislative, I mean, mostly GAO reviews the executive branch, but GAO does some work on legislative branch agencies also.
Yeah. But I was really impressed that they spelled out so much of what you had recommended earlier. And it's great to see it incubating in such a high priority agency, high visibility agency. So if there's any closing comments, then I'll just say thank you so much. And while I'm thanking you all, I'll ask Nick to come on and close out the show.
Yeah, I
We
want to
could-
say hi to Nick. I almost forgot. Nick, man, you've been with ALN for a few years now too. How long you been around?
Oh man, that's a great question. At least 6, Mike,
Yeah,
7,
okay.
8.
7,
I mean, it's
Yeah, but
possibly
going
8.
on.
Yeah.
Well, you got to tell me how you avoided aging during that time.
Ash, you may notice I used to wear more facial hair and you just slowly trim it back as you age.
With the gray, yeah, no, I know what you mean.
Good
Well,
to see you,
and
Keith.
in that regard, it's really nice to welcome Crystal and also Kyle in their first presentations at the ALN. We hope to see you at many more of these forums. It's quite the honor for us to be providing these.
Yeah, and the network would not continue without involving new people. That's the goal. We want to keep reaching, amplifying all the missions represented here today. And with that, just a big thank you for everyone attending. Also, our presenters, especially tomorrow on an exciting program with a panel of federal executives. And just a big thank you to our patron members, Jacobs, Mantech, Onuma, ABS Quality Evaluations, and CGI, and all our other organizational members. And please reach out if you'd like to join this list, because we would like to share this message everywhere. And we do think it has value to almost everyone. And so, yeah, this is what's happening tomorrow at our normal Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern program. And then we will have a program next Thursday at 3 also that is related to the series.
And I just want to point out that the National Institute of Building Sciences is a quasi-government entity. They have 3 board members appointed by Congress and 3 appointed by the executive office. And the work that they do is available to all the agencies and is public available to all organizations. And their focus on digital twins is critical in tying facilities to the personal properties, fleets, and all the assets together. Digital twins are for all assets, buildings and personal property. So getting digital twins right can be hugely beneficial to organizations. So we're very happy that they like working with us, and our members are presenting at that Digital Twins Conference. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Nick. We can't forget thanking Dominic Townsend and Jim Dieter for kicking things off, and appreciate all the audience members, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.